Foderato, and this is Bridge Prep. My guest is Damali Rett, a highly recognized strategy consultant and career coach. During her time as a management consultant, Damali specialized in working on financial strategy and processes to create value for employees and shareholders alike. She recently joined Enviva Biomass as commercial director, where she is in charge of new market development and commercial operations. Damali is also the founder of Amendment 9 Consulting, a career and strategy consulting firm. In her personal time, Damali is an active speaker on leadership and business topics for a variety of organizations and is a commissioner for the District of Columbia. Damali received her MBA from Dartmouth Tech School of Business. Damali, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So talk to me a little bit about your current role and responsibilities at Enviva.
Sure. So I guess the first thing is that Enviva is a company that makes wood pellets. And in my career, it's actually been interesting. This is the first company I've worked for that actually has manufactured something tangible, where you can actually hold it in your hand and use it. So that's been quite an adjustment. But a lot of my role and responsibilities, I almost call myself an internal consultant because I deal with a little bit of everything. And so Enviva considers itself a startup. They've been around for the last, in some form or fashion, for the last 14 years or so, but they have been, taken on a number of kind of different roles, and they operate very, very leanly. And so I actually report into one of the co-founders, and my day-to-day may change. So it may be looking at new markets. I'm using a lot of my consulting background and adding a lot of process and operational aspects. It may be just brainstorming. It may be hosting clients. I've actually had to take clients, to come see our plants and been in the car with them and driving them around and showing them the plants. So it could be a little mix of everything, working with our legal department, offering what we call a commercial or business perspective. So, what are the things that are most important to us from a business perspective? Should we consider this rather than just a legal or risk perspective? So that's a little bit about kind of what I do, but it absolutely changes from day to day.
Great. And what of all of those responsibilities do you find most rewarding?
I think I find that I can actually see immediate impact. And so I really like the new market development. So I'll give an example. We're entering a new market, and I was able to utilize my contacts and within 6 weeks, develop, not just have 2 meetings with this, large potential client, but also develop and see, sitting down with the CEO, with our VPs, developing and showing what I've put together as a strategy and approach to enter that market, so working with the teams, but really able to see and have decisions made really quickly is something that I'm really excited about, and really having, a voice and a seat at the table.
Great. Now, what personal characteristics would you say make someone a good fit for new market development?
So I think part of it is kind of being curious and a lot of research. And so new markets, anybody who's studied business or anybody who has looked at niches know that there are a lot of variabilities. There's a lot of risk. And so it's really trying to figure out what is our risk tolerance. If you look at something like Palm Pilot and Apple, for example, Palm Pilot owned the market of essentially what became the iPhone for a long time, but simply just refused to enter the phone market. And so there's a lot of kind of, similarities of, do we want to be the next new Coke, or are we going to be, the successful Diet Coke? And so it's really just kind of looking at risk. I think people who thrive in that are people who are going to naturally kind of be risk takers. You also need to have a lot of influence. You're going to have to convince people of why they need to make the change and commit, not just money, but also human resources, human capital behind projects where payoffs may not be immediate. And then the last thing is you need to know somebody who is going to be good at kind of what I'll say letting things go. One of the things if you do decide to enter a market is trying to figure out, what is the appropriate point and what is the measurement by which you said, what, we've tried, we've done all we can, we fought the good fight, but we need to throw in the towel. And so also making sure that you can keep a clear head about that, because it is very often, you feel attached to something, but if it's time to let it go, you need to make sure you're letting it go.
Sure. I actually want to go back to a previous point you made about being a risk taker, and I'm wondering if you've always considered yourself a risk taker or if you think that's a quality that someone can actually hone.
I think it's both. So I have actually, I'm really glad you asked that, because a lot of the people in my jobs, and I have junior staff, one of the things I tell them is what is the worst thing that can happen? And the worst thing that can actually happen, particularly if you're pretty junior, is that you get fired. And I know that sounds a little trite, but a lot of people have said when I've kind of said that to them, it actually puts things in perspective. If you're not doing anything illegal, you're not doing anything unethical, you're not going to jail, but that kind of frees you up to be able to maybe take some risk. So I was actually going through some files and actually found, a couple of letters and things I wrote when I was younger. One of whom, in one of my first jobs ever, I actually wrote a memo to the senior VP of customer relations outlining points, that we could use to improve the customer experience. And my boss was freaked out because I was going to somebody so senior in the company. And my response was, well, what's he going to do? He's either going to say no, but he's not going to really do anything bad. And so, being able to take small risks, I think once you start small and you realize that your worst fear is not going to come true, that gives you confidence to start taking more and more risks. There is something, if you're feeling hesitant or you're feeling, outside parties, at times you do want to listen to them, but, feel free to take a small risk, to reach out to somebody that you didn't think would respond to you. You'd be surprised.
Sure, and always ask yourself what really is that worst thing that can happen.
Exactly.
Great. So let's talk a bit about what attracted you to Enviva in the first place. What led you to that company in particular?
So a combination of things. I think one, so my background has been in management consulting. So I've been in management consulting for 8 years, which in consulting is actually considered very, very a very long time. And was making the change. And one of the tips I have for people, if you're going to, I hear a lot is I'm not sure what I want to do. And so I knew that if I wanted to leave consulting, I wanted it to be a very deliberate move. Consulting has a lot of great benefits, but I wanted to say, if I'm going to leave, I want it to be a very deliberate move. I wanted a lot of the same aspects of consulting. So earlier I talked about, that my job is different from day to day, that I have a lot of influence. I'm putting together presentations. I'm kind of using background processes as well. But looking for my consulting specialty was a lot around energy and processes. And so ideally wanted to stay in that field. And it worked out great because Enviva considers itself a sustainability company. And so, being able to bring my background in, regulated industries of electricity and oil and gas, able to bring that background and kind of see and apply that in a sustainable way was really appealing to me. But the big takeaway, I would say for anybody is really be deliberate about what you're looking for and really be deliberate about the skills that, one, you're really good at, and then two, be deliberate about the skills that you actually like. Because just because you're good at something doesn't mean that you actually like doing it. And at work, you really want to focus on what are those skills that I am good at and those skills that I like doing.
Great. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges that you hear of people who are in your situation of looking to transition outside of full-time management consulting, but not really sure, that they wanted to let go of a lot of those elements? What are some of the challenges that you found people face who, were in that same position you were in?
I think one of the first challenges in consulting is that it's very easy to become, what I'll say is a jack of all trades and a master of none. And so because of a consultant, you're constantly reinventing yourself. The market changes, business changes, focus changes. And while you develop an expertise, the way that you apply and use that expertise may change. And so I think it is a little bit about what I talked about, which is really figuring out what are the best parts about consulting that you like. And so I had someone who was a consultant. I was speaking with her and said, what do you really like? And it turns out she actually likes that whole reporting and digging down and some of that more specific things and less, and really working with clients. So those are the two big things that she really loved. She really loved being client-facing and really loved this kind of reporting piece. So once you take that, then you actually use that to figure out what is my exit strategy. It's very easy, again, being a consultant, you get a lot of, recruiters calling you, asking you to do a lot of different things, but some of those things may not fit. And so if you really figure out, again, it's going back to really making sure you understand what are the skills that you are good at and that you're passionate about doing. And that will manifest itself. I've actually, when I was, looking for a new job, actually turned down jobs and actually wound up, removing myself from a couple of processes after I went in and felt, either the company wasn't right, the role wasn't right, or the culture wasn't right. And so once you figure that out, you'll see that opportunities start opening up. And don't be afraid to say no. I think that's something else that if you're transitioning out of consulting, you can kind of sometimes reach a wall where you're feeling like, I have to leave right now. But don't let that wall derail you. And then the last piece of advice, and I've given this to numerous consultants, is you really do need to time box your job search. You need to say within 90 days, I'm going to be out. And the reason for that is, as a consultant, you're generally on the road, you're working crazy hours. It is very easy to stay on that wheel. But until you actually commit and make a plan for, how often you're going to update your resume, how often you're going to update your LinkedIn profile, what, informal informational interviews are you going to have on Fridays when you're home, who are you going to reach out into your networks? You really need to put that to paper just like you would do a project plan, because otherwise you'll look up, and this happened to me, and it's 2 years later and you're like, oh, I'm still a consultant. So that's my long-winded advice for people transitioning out of consulting.
Great, and you obviously have a lot of career advice to dispense. We mentioned you're the founder of Amendment 9 Consulting, a career and strategy consulting firm. Have you always been an entrepreneur? I think I've always kind of been a little bit of a side hustler. And so I think it started, I remember my very, very first side gig, and I'm going to date myself, but this was back when dial-up was still through modems, and they had teen chat rooms. And I would go online and moderate a teen chat room, and literally the biggest fights would be between Britney and Christina and NSYNC and Backstreet Boys. And so my job was to go in and basically flag, comments that were over the top and, kind of pushing it. And so I think that's one of the things of why I stayed in consulting for so long. But, I always urge people to really be honest with yourself. And when I sat down, a few years ago, I really just liked helping people. And part of that is I always, people would always come to me and ask me questions and, say, what do you think about this? And, take that advice. And I saw that I was like, oh, this is actually, something that people like and they appreciate it. So. Great. And it all goes back to boy bands.
It does. It goes back to boy bands and pop stars.
Who would have thunk? All right. Well, we just have time for a few more questions, but I do want to switch gears a bit and touch on a somewhat provocative question. Why do you want people to talk about you behind your back? What does that mean to you?
So what that means to me, and this kind of absolutely resonated with me in consulting, but also even prior, is that people are propelled through their careers not just by the work that they do, but by the relationships that they build. And so, you know, you may do an amazing job on your project, but if people don't feel like they actually know you on a more personal level or don't know who you are, you know, in terms of personality, they're not going to really give you that extra push that you need. And so, you know, one of the things, the little secrets that people don't know about consulting or they find out after is that in the evaluation room, they literally ask, who here knows Damali? And if no hands go up, that means that something's, you know, you're doing something wrong. And if you want, you know, the CEO knows who I am, right, of my company. You know, when I was at my prior firm, my prior consulting firm, the head of my department knew exactly who I was. And that was by design, because they can't say, if they have a great project going to Paris, they can't assign me to that project if they don't even know I exist. And if they not only need to know that I exist, but they need to know what are my skill sets, what value am I bringing, and how have I, like, you know, essentially to be crass a little bit, how have I made the money in the past? And so once people really understand that and know that, you know, it's those hallway conversations that happen, right? It's the passing of, hey, you know, we're looking at a new project in, you know, Copenhagen. Hey, you know what? I heard Damali speaks, you know, has been to Denmark before. I haven't. But, you know, like it's those type of conversations that are passing that you have no idea that are passing that really push you. And that all goes back to brand. And I know people talk about that and throw that word around, but it's just not just that the conversations are happening, but it's also what is being said in those conversations. And you want those conversations to promote the skills that you have and, you know, kind of what you bring to the table.
Great. And that actually feeds into a little bit my last question. We've heard about in recent years in particular the concept of, you know, imposter syndrome and how that might hold someone back from maybe forging those really close relationships. Talk to me a little bit about imposter syndrome.
That's a great question. And so, you know, the imposter syndrome, if people don't know what that is, it's that feeling that you're not good enough. Or that feeling, you know, I like to use business school as an example. So it's feeling, you know, your first day of school, you meet your study group, and, you know, one kid in your study group is 23, has started, you know, sold a business to Google for $300 million. You know, somebody else found the cure for cancer, and you just worked at a nonprofit. You know, you feel like you just worked at a nonprofit that was, you know, really small and didn't have much to offer. But you are there for a reason. And so one of the things, if you have a seat at the table, you absolutely need to deserve to be at that table. And in particular, you need to figure out how and why you can brag. And so one of the most difficult exercises I actually ever had to do was write down all of my accomplishments and all of the things I had done. And so when I was looking for jobs, I actually did that because it gave me points to talk about in interviews, of course, but it also made me feel like, yes, I belong here. Yes, I deserve a seat at this table. Because it can be intimidating. So like at my job, I am not only the only woman, I am also the only person of color at that table. But I remind myself that I am at that table. And so it, you know, like if I'm feeling like, oh my God, like these people, you know, like we have some very senior superstars, right? But I deserve to be at that table. And so, you know, once you get that confidence, it will make you do things like speak up in meetings. because people notice that, and that's another way to get noticed, not in an annoying bad way, but in a way that says, hey, that was a really good idea that Damali had at that meeting today. It also is making sure that if you say something in that meeting and you're not heard and somebody repeats it, it's having enough confidence to say, yes, that is actually what I said 5 minutes ago. Thank you very much. And again, not in a way that's off-putting, but in a way that reminds people, again, of the value and that you're there at that table. There's actually really lots of good books, lots of good articles. I've struggled with it. This is one of those things that I think the more we talk about it and the more that we can open up, the easier it gets, right, where you feel like you can be your authentic self. You feel like you belong there. And it absolutely relates to that idea of relationship building, pushing ahead as you work harder and harder.
Great. And would you mind sharing with us one of your favorite books or maybe a recent article on the topic?
Yeah, no. So there's actually a great book called The Empress Has No Clothes, written by Joyce Roche, and she was an executive at Avon for many, many years, and then actually went on to be the founder of Girls Inc. And so I found this book and I actually recommended it to people because one of the things she talks about in her book is how the imposter syndrome cuts across gender, race, and class. And so, people kind of feel like, oh, it's something that applies to women or something that applies to, only to minorities or something that applies, but it doesn't. It's actually one of those things that, she has essays and kind of personal stories from people across all lines, all aspects, men, women, different backgrounds, some people who grew up with what you would perceive to be, that's a background that should give you confidence. So The Empress Has No Clothes is definitely something I would recommend.
Great, by Joyce Roche.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Damali, that's unfortunately all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.